cafe became busiest when the rain started. People rushed inside carrying wet umbrellas, shaking water from their jackets, while the smell of fresh coffee filled the warm little room. Outside, the city streets looked gray and cold, but inside the cafe everything felt alive. Cups clinked together, quiet music played through old speakers, and tired strangers searched for empty seats near the windows. Near the back corner stood an old piano that most people barely noticed anymore. It was dark brown, scratched on the sides, and missing a little piece of wood near the bottom pedal. Some keys sounded too sharp while others felt heavy when pressed. The cafe owner once joked that the piano was older than half the customers who visited the place. Almost nobody touched it. A small sign rested on top of the piano that read, "Feel free to play," but people usually smiled at the sign and walked away. Behind the counter, a young waitress moved quickly between tables carrying coffee mugs and dessert plates. She worked quietly, never drawing attention to herself. Customers remembered her as polite and calm, but most didn't know much about her. She rarely joined conversations with coworkers and almost never talked about her personal life. Still, one thing about her always stood out. Every time she walked past the piano, she looked at it for just a second longer than everyone else. Not enough for people to notice, but enough to mean something. That Friday night had already been chaotic before the heavy rain began. The cafe owner had planned a small live music evening to bring in more customers. A local jazz trio was supposed to arrive around 7 o'clock and perform near the windows. By 8, the musicians still hadn't arrived. The owner checked his phone every few minutes while trying not to panic. More customers kept entering the cafe, hoping to hear live music while escaping the storm outside. Every seat became full. Some people even stood near the walls holding paper cups of hot tea. The mood slowly changed from excitement to impatience. "Where's the band?" one customer asked loudly. "They're probably stuck somewhere," another replied. At a table near the center of the cafe, a group of college students laughed while recording short videos for social media. One of them pointed toward the old piano. "Someone should play something," he joked. Another looked toward the waitress carrying plates nearby. "What about her?" he said with a grin. "She looks like she knows piano." The group laughed lightly. The waitress froze for half a second but kept walking. One of the students called out kindly, not realizing how nervous she suddenly felt. "Hey, can you play something simple while we wait?" Several people nearby turned toward her. The cafe owner looked embarrassed. "Leave her alone," he said quickly. "She's working." But now customers had become interested. "Come on," another person added. "Just one song. It'll make the waiting easier. Even a beginner song is fine." The room filled with small laughs and harmless cheering. The waitress felt heat rise into her face. She wanted to refuse politely and continue working. That would have been easier, safer, because nobody there knew the truth. Nobody knew that years ago, music had once been the center of her entire life. Nobody knew how many nights she had spent sitting beside a piano until sunrise while everyone else slept. Nobody knew why she stopped playing in public. For a moment she stood still, holding a tray tightly in both hands. Then the cafe owner walked closer and lowered his voice. "You don't have to do it," he whispered kindly. She looked toward the piano again. The old instrument sat quietly beneath the warm yellow lights, almost waiting. Something deep inside her chest stirred painfully. Memories. A small apartment filled with music. An older pair of hands guiding her fingers across piano keys. Soft laughter after missed notes. Long practice hours. Dreams she had once believed would come true. Then disappointment. Silence. Walking away from music completely. She swallowed hard and finally gave a small nod. "Okay," she said softly. The customers clapped playfully as she placed the tray down near the counter. Nobody expected much. That was what made the moment different. She walked slowly toward the piano while conversations continued around the room. Some people barely looked up from their phones. Others smiled politely, expecting a short performance from a shy waitress trying her best. The bench creaked quietly as she sat down. For a second, her hands rested motionless above the keys. She almost stood back up. Her heart beat so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. It had been a long time since she played in front of strangers. A very long time. The rain tapped softly against the windows while the cafe slowly became quieter. Even the students who started the joke now looked curious. One customer whispered, "She's really nervous." Another shrugged. "It's just for fun." The waitress took a slow breath. Then she pressed the first key. A simple note echoed gently through the cafe. Then another. And another. The melody was small and familiar, the kind children learned during their first piano lessons. A few people smiled immediately after recognizing it. "Oh, I know this song," someone whispered. The tune sounded soft and careful at first. Her fingers moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if she was testing whether the piano still trusted her after all these years. The room relaxed again. Some customers returned to their conversations. Others continued drinking coffee. The college students grinned at each other proudly, believing they had successfully convinced a shy waitress to entertain the cafe for a few minutes. But then something changed. It happened so naturally that almost nobody noticed the exact moment. The simple melody began stretching into something new. The notes became smoother, richer, more alive. Her left hand shifted into deeper chords while her right hand danced freely across the higher keys. The beginner tune slowly transformed into flowing jazz rhythms filled with emotion and confidence. One customer stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Another slowly lowered his coffee cup. Near the counter, the cafe owner stared in complete disbelief. The shy waitress they had worked beside for nearly 2 years suddenly looked like someone else entirely. Her shoulders relaxed, her fear disappeared, and her hands moved across the piano with unbelievable freedom. The music filled every corner of the cafe. Fast notes rolled like falling rain while softer melodies slipped between them with perfect control. It no longer sounded like someone casually playing for customers. It sounded personal, powerful, real. People turned fully toward the piano now. Phones slowly lifted into the air as customers started recording. The students who had joked earlier exchanged shocked looks. "No way," one whispered. An older man near the window leaned forward silently, unable to take his eyes off her fingers. The waitress herself seemed lost inside the music now. Her face remained calm, but every emotion she had hidden for years poured into the piano. Loneliness, fear, hope, pain, freedom. The old instrument that once sounded forgotten suddenly came alive beneath her hands. Even the broken keys somehow sounded beautiful. Outside, rain continued pouring through the dark streets. But inside the cafe, nobody cared about the storm anymore, because the room had become completely silent except for the piano. And for the first time in years, the young waitress finally stopped hiding who she really was. The final piano note faded slowly into the cafe. For a moment, nobody moved. The room stayed completely silent except for the sound of rain outside the windows. Even the coffee machine behind the counter seemed louder now that the music had stopped. The young waitress kept her hands resting lightly on the piano keys. Her breathing was uneven, and her heart still raced inside her chest. She had not planned any of this. She only meant to play a short beginner song and return to work quietly. Instead, every person in the cafe was staring at her. Then suddenly, applause exploded through the room. People stood from their chairs clapping loudly. Some whistled in amazement while others looked at each other with shocked smiles. The sound filled every corner of the cafe so strongly that the waitress almost jumped in surprise. No way! That was unbelievable! Was she seriously working here this whole time? One of the college students who had joked earlier shook his head slowly. "I thought she only knew basic piano." Another laughed in disbelief. "Basic? That sounded like a concert." The waitress lowered her eyes quickly, uncomfortable with so much attention. Her face turned red as she stood carefully from the piano bench. But the applause didn't stop. Near the window, an older woman wiped tears from her eyes. A man sitting beside her smiled gently. "She played with real feeling," the woman whispered softly. "You can always tell when music comes from the heart." The cafe owner walked toward the piano looking completely stunned. You never told me you could play like that, he said quietly. The waitress gave a nervous smile. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Before he could answer, another customer stepped closer holding up a phone. Excuse me, he asked politely. Would you mind if I posted the video online? Her expression changed immediately. What video? I recorded your performance, he explained carefully. Only because it was incredible. Several other people lifted their phones too. We recorded it too. You're going viral for sure. The waitress felt panic rise inside her stomach. No, please, she said softly. I'd rather not. Most customers understood immediately and lowered their phones respectfully. But the man who first recorded the performance looked hesitant. I run a small music page online, he explained. I promise I'd post it respectfully. People deserve to hear this. The waitress didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to disappear into the kitchen and avoid every conversation. Another part of her felt something she had not felt in years. A tiny spark of happiness. Not because people were clapping. Not because they were impressed. But because for a few minutes she had forgotten to be afraid. The cafe owner stepped in kindly. Give her some space, he told the crowd. She still has work to do. People slowly returned to their seats, though the energy inside the cafe had completely changed now. Customers continued whispering excitedly while glancing toward the piano every few seconds. The waitress quickly carried empty cups and cleaned tables again, but nothing felt normal anymore. Everywhere she walked, people smiled at her differently, not as a quiet employee, but as someone they suddenly wanted to know. A middle-aged man stopped her near the counter. How long have you played piano? A long time, she answered simply. You should be performing somewhere bigger than this cafe. She forced a small smile. I'm fine here, but deep down his words stayed in her mind. Because years ago she had once believed the same thing. Near closing time, the rain finally slowed outside. Customers slowly began leaving the cafe, but many stopped beside the piano before going home. One woman touched the old wood gently and laughed. I can't believe that sound came from this thing. The cafe owner chuckled. Honestly, I didn't think it was possible either. The waitress stayed mostly quiet through all of it. Around midnight, only a few people remained inside. The college students who had started everything prepared to leave. As they walked toward the door, one of them stopped beside her awkwardly. Hey, he said. Sorry if we embarrassed you earlier. It's okay, she replied softly. No, seriously, he continued. We were joking around. We didn't expect. He looked back toward the piano. That. For the first time that night, she laughed a little. It's fine, she said. The student smiled. You should play again sometime. After they left, the cafe finally became quiet. The owner locked the front door and turned the sign outside from open to closed. Then he looked at her seriously. You've been hiding this from everybody? She placed clean cups onto a shelf carefully before answering. I used to play a lot. Used to? She nodded. What happened? For a second, she considered telling him the truth. About the music academy. About the pressure. About the criticism that slowly destroyed her confidence. About the day she stopped touching a piano completely. But speaking about those memories still hurt too much. So instead, she gave the simplest answer possible. Life happened. The owner studied her face quietly but didn't push further. Well, he finally said, whatever happened, don't stop playing again. She looked away quickly. That's not really my world anymore. Maybe it should be. She didn't answer. A few minutes later, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets glistened from rainwater while traffic lights reflected across puddles on the road. The city looked peaceful after the storm. As she walked toward the bus stop, her phone buzzed inside her pocket. Then again, and again. Confused, she pulled it out. Messages filled the screen nonstop. Co-workers, old classmates, even people she barely remembered. At first she thought something terrible had happened. Then she opened one message. Is this really you? Below the text was a video link. Her stomach dropped instantly. Someone had uploaded the piano performance already. She stopped walking beneath a streetlight and clicked the video carefully. The recording began shakily from the back corner of the cafe. The sound of people talking filled the first few seconds. Then the camera focused on her sitting nervously at the piano. She almost closed the video immediately. But then the music started. Standing alone on the wet sidewalk, she watched herself transform the simple beginner tune into something alive and emotional. The comments below the video increased every second. This gave me chills. Who is she? That ending was beautiful. She needs to perform professionally. Thousands of views appeared beneath the clip already. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Another message arrived from an unknown number. You may not remember me, but we studied at the same music school years ago. I just saw the video. You should never have stopped playing. Her chest tightened painfully. She locked the phone quickly and slipped it back into her pocket. The bus ride home felt unreal. Every few minutes her phone vibrated again with new notifications. She ignored all of them and stared silently out the window while city lights blurred across the glass. By the time she reached her apartment building, the video had spread even further. Inside her small apartment, everything felt quiet and familiar again. A bookshelf stood near the wall beside a tiny kitchen table. A lamp glowed softly in the corner. Nothing about the room suggested that its owner once dreamed of becoming a musician. Except for one thing. Near the window sat a keyboard covered carefully with a cloth. She hadn't touched it in months. Maybe longer. Slowly, she walked toward it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she removed the cover. Dust covered some of the keys. She stared at the instrument silently while memories returned one after another. Long practice nights. Music competitions. Teachers correcting every mistake. The excitement she once felt before performances. And the crushing disappointment that came later. She closed her eyes tightly. You're not good enough. The old words still echoed clearly in her mind even after all these years. But tonight felt different. Because for the first time in a very long time, strangers had listened to her music without judging her. They hadn't cared about perfection. They simply felt something. Her phone buzzed again across the table. This time she finally looked. Another new message appeared. But this one made her completely freeze. Hello. I organize live performances for the City Jazz Festival. Someone sent me your video tonight. Please contact me if you're interested in performing. She stared at the message for a long time without moving. The small light from her phone reflected across the dark apartment while rainwater still slid slowly down the window beside her. Everything around her felt strangely quiet now, almost unreal. A jazz festival. Performing live. In front of people again. Her chest tightened immediately. She placed the phone face down on the table and stepped away from it like it had become dangerous. No, she whispered to herself. That world was behind her. It had been behind her for years. The performance at the cafe was only an accident. A random moment. Nothing more. At least that was what she tried to believe. But deep inside, something had already changed. She walked back toward the keyboard near the window and sat down slowly. Her fingers rested above the keys without pressing them. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee from her coat. Outside, distant traffic moved through wet streets while the city slowly fell asleep. But she couldn't sleep at all. Her mind kept replaying the cafe performance over and over again. The shocked faces, the silence in the room, the applause, and the feeling she experienced while playing. Freedom. She had forgotten what that felt like. For years, music had only brought pressure and disappointment. Every note used to feel like a test she could fail. But at the cafe, nobody cared about perfection. People simply listened. That thought stayed with her the entire night. By morning, the video online had spread even further. When she finally opened her phone again, thousands of notifications filled the screen. The original clip had been shared across multiple social media pages overnight. Some videos already had hundreds of thousands of views. Comments appeared faster than she could read them. This is pure talent. The way she transformed that simple melody gave me chills. You can feel real emotion in her playing. Some people don't just play music. They tell stories with it. She kept scrolling silently, almost uncomfortable reading strangers talk about her like that. Then she saw another comment. Whoever convinced her to stop playing should be ashamed. Her eyes stopped there for a moment, because those words hurt more than the others. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Her phone rang suddenly, making her jump. It was the cafe owner. She answered carefully. Hello. You need to see what's happening online, he said immediately. I already did. No, I mean really see it, he replied. People are coming to the cafe asking about you. She sat upright. What? 3 different customers already came in this morning asking if you're working today. One woman drove from another town after watching the video. She covered her forehead tiredly. This is getting out of control. The owner laughed softly. Maybe, but honestly, I think people are just inspired. She didn't answer. A short silence passed before he spoke again. You coming in tonight? She hesitated. Part of her suddenly feared walking back into the cafe. She imagined customers staring at her, recording videos, asking questions she didn't want to answer. I don't know, she admitted quietly. You don't have to hide. His voice sounded gentle now. Listen, he continued. Last night was the happiest I've seen you since you started working here. That sentence stayed in her mind after the call ended, because she realized he might be right. Later that afternoon, she finally forced herself outside. She wore a hoodie and kept her head lowered while walking through crowded streets, hoping nobody would recognize her. First, everything seemed normal, until she entered a small grocery store near her apartment. The cashier looked at her carefully. Then his eyes widened. Wait, he said slowly. You're the piano girl. She froze instantly. 2 customers nearby turned toward her. Oh wow, it is her. I watched that video like 5 times. You were amazing. She thanked them politely but quickly paid for her groceries and left. Her hands shook slightly as she walked back outside. The attention felt overwhelming already. She wasn't used to people noticing her. For years, she had built a quiet life where nobody expected anything from her. She worked, paid rent, avoided attention, and stayed invisible. Invisible felt safe. But now that safety was disappearing fast. When evening arrived, she almost decided not to go to work. She stood near the apartment door wearing her coat while arguing with herself internally. If she stayed home, maybe everything would calm down eventually. Maybe people would move on to another viral video tomorrow. But another voice inside her whispered something different. What if this was the opportunity she once dreamed about? The thought scared her more than anything else. Finally, after several minutes, she grabbed her bag and left for the cafe. The moment she arrived, she knew things had changed. The place was completely packed. People filled nearly every table, and several customers stood near the entrance waiting for seats. Loud conversations filled the room while phones pointed toward the piano in the corner. The cafe owner spotted her immediately. There you are, he said with relief. I thought you might not come. She looked around nervously. Why are there so many people? He gave her a look. You really have to ask? A few customers noticed her near the entrance. Whispers spread instantly. That's her. She's here. Ask her to play again. The waitress suddenly wanted to turn around and leave immediately. But before she could move, a young girl around 12 years old approached, carefully holding a notebook against her chest. Excuse me, the girl said shyly. I just wanted to say, after watching your video, I started practicing piano again today. The waitress blinked in surprise. You play piano too? A little, the girl smiled nervously. But I stopped because I thought I wasn't good enough. Those words hit hard. Very hard. The waitress knelt slightly so they stood eye level. You don't have to be perfect to love music, she said softly. The girl smiled brighter after hearing that. Her mother thanked the waitress warmly before leading her back to their table. For several seconds, the waitress remained frozen near the entrance, because she realized something important. The video was not only making people notice her, it was making people feel something that scared her, but it also touched something deep inside her heart. The night became busier than usual. Customers continued asking questions while ordering coffee. Did you study music? Are you performing somewhere soon? How long have you been playing? She answered politely but briefly. Whenever conversations became too personal, she quickly returned to work. Still, the piano in the corner kept pulling her attention. Every time she walked past it, customers looked hopeful, as if waiting. Near 9 o'clock, one customer finally asked the question everyone wanted answered. Will you play again tonight? The entire cafe suddenly grew quieter. The waitress stopped cleaning a table slowly. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Her heart immediately started racing again. The owner spoke before she could answer. Only if she wants to. The room waited patiently. She looked toward the piano, then toward the customers, then finally down at her own hands. For years, fear had controlled her life. Fear of failing. Fear of judgment. Fear of not being enough. But something about the young girl earlier kept returning to her mind. You don't have to be perfect to love music. Slowly, she took a breath. Then she nodded. The room burst into applause instantly. This time, however, things felt different as she walked toward the piano. Last night she played by accident. Tonight she was choosing to. She sat down carefully while phones quietly lifted around the room again. But now she tried not to focus on them. Instead, she closed her eyes for 1 second, and remembered why she fell in love with music in the first place. Not for competitions. Not for approval. Not for fame. For connection. Her fingers touched the keys softly. A deep, emotional chord filled the cafe. Conversations stopped immediately. This time she didn't begin with a beginner song. This time she played something entirely her own. The melody started slowly, almost fragile, before growing stronger with every passing second. The music carried sadness inside it, but also warmth, like someone telling the story of getting lost and slowly finding the way back home again. People listened without speaking. Some customers even lowered their phones halfway through because recording suddenly felt less important than simply hearing the music live. Near the back of the cafe, a man wearing a dark coat watched silently from his table. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't filming. He wasn't smiling. He simply listened carefully with crossed arms and thoughtful eyes. When the performance ended, applause filled the room again. But the man in the dark coat stayed seated. Then slowly, he stood up and walked toward the piano. The waitress looked nervous immediately. The stranger stopped beside her calmly. You probably don't remember me, he said quietly. The moment she saw his face clearly, her stomach dropped. Because she remembered him instantly. He had once been one of her music instructors years ago. The cafe suddenly felt much smaller. The applause from the customers slowly faded into silence as the older man stood beside the piano. The waitress stared at him without speaking while memories she tried to bury years ago rushed back all at once. Same serious face. Same calm voice. Same eyes that once watched every mistake she made during music classes. He looked older now, with gray beginning to appear near his hairline, but she recognized him immediately. One of the most respected instructors at the music academy she attended years earlier. The same place where her confidence slowly disappeared. You remember me, he said quietly. She nodded once. The room around them still buzzed softly with curious whispers, but neither of them seemed to notice anymore. The cafe owner looked confused. You two know each other? The older man kept his eyes on the waitress. She was one of the most gifted students I ever taught. Several nearby customers reacted with surprise. The waitress lowered her gaze immediately, uncomfortable hearing those words. Because years ago, things had not ended that way. Not even close. The instructor pulled a chair nearby and sat down slowly beside the piano. You disappeared, he said gently. The waitress folded her arms tightly. I didn't disappear. I left. A short silence followed. The customers nearby pretended not to listen, but everyone clearly was. The instructor nodded carefully. Yes, you left. She could still remember the exact day. The pressure. The endless criticism. The feeling that nothing she played was ever enough. At the academy, perfection mattered more than emotion. Every student competed constantly. Mistakes were treated like failures instead of part of learning. And while her technical skill had always been strong, the teachers hated one thing about her playing: improvisation. They said she ignored structure too much. They said she played with too much emotion. They said professional musicians followed rules. But music never felt alive to her when every note was controlled. She loved freedom inside music. That freedom eventually became the reason she stopped believing in herself. The instructor glanced toward the old café piano. "What you played tonight," he said quietly, "was extraordinary." She almost laughed at the irony. Years ago, he would never have called it that. "You used to say my improvisation was distracting," she replied softly. His expression changed slightly. "I know." The honesty surprised her. The instructor leaned back in his chair with a tired sigh. "When you studied at the academy, we trained students for competitions and orchestras. Structure mattered there. Discipline mattered. We believed emotion alone wasn't enough." She crossed her arms tighter. "And if someone played differently, we corrected them." The waitress looked away toward the rainy windows. "Some of us broke because of it." The words came out more painfully than she expected. The instructor became quiet for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly. "I know that too." That answer caught her off guard. She looked at him carefully for the first time that night. He no longer carried the same cold confidence she remembered from years earlier. Tonight he looked tired, reflective, almost regretful. "You were one of the few students who made audiences feel something immediately," he continued softly. "At the time, I thought controlling that emotion would make you stronger. And instead, maybe we made you afraid of your own gift." The cafe became silent again. Even nearby customers stopped pretending not to listen. The waitress swallowed hard, because part of her had waited years to hear someone admit that. But hearing it now didn't magically erase the damage. After leaving the academy, she had spent years avoiding music completely. Watching other people succeed became painful. Every piano reminded her of failure instead of joy. Until the cafe performance changed everything unexpectedly. The instructor studied her face carefully. "Why did you stop playing entirely?" She laughed softly, but there was sadness inside it. "Because I got tired of feeling like I disappointed everyone." "You didn't disappoint everyone." "No," she replied quietly. "I walked away from the only thing I ever truly loved." The instructor looked toward the customers sitting around the cafe. "After hearing this room tonight," he said, "I don't think music ever left you." Those words stayed hanging in the air between them. The waitress didn't know how to answer, because deep inside, she feared he might be right. The cafe owner suddenly interrupted awkwardly. "Okay," he said carefully. "I feel like I missed about 10 years of backstory here." A few customers laughed softly, easing the tension slightly. The instructor smiled faintly for the first time. Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded paper. "There's actually another reason I came tonight." He placed the paper gently on top of the piano keys. The waitress looked down. It was a formal invitation. A live audition for the City Jazz Festival. The same festival that had messaged her online earlier. Her stomach tightened again immediately. "They contacted me this morning after seeing the video," the instructor explained. "They asked if I knew you." "And what did you tell them?" "The truth," he answered. "That ignoring your talent would be a mistake." She stared at the paper silently. Performing at the festival would mean standing in front of hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Cameras, tension, expectations, everything she spent years avoiding. "I can't do this," she whispered. The instructor didn't argue immediately. Instead, he looked around the cafe slowly. "You already are." She frowned slightly. "Look at these people," he said. The customers nearby became awkward after realizing they were being included in the conversation. "They're not impressed because you played perfectly," the instructor continued. "They connected with you because your music felt honest." The waitress looked down at the piano keys again. Honest. That word mattered more to her than technical perfection ever had. Still, fear remained stronger. "What if I fail?" she asked quietly. The instructor smiled sadly. Every musician fails sometimes. That's easy to say. No, he replied gently. It isn't. For the first time, his voice carried real emotion. I spent years teaching students to chase perfection. Some succeeded. Some quit completely. Looking back, he paused briefly, I think I forgot why people fall in love with music in the first place. The waitress looked at him carefully. He truly meant it. Before she could respond, a customer near the back suddenly spoke up. You should do the festival. Another customer nodded immediately. Absolutely. The whole city would show up after that video. A young woman near the counter smiled warmly. You already helped people tonight without realizing it. More voices joined in. You inspired my daughter. You made everyone forget their problems for a few minutes. That matters. The waitress felt overwhelmed again by all the attention. But this time something felt different. These people were not asking her to become famous. They simply wanted her to keep playing. The instructor stood slowly from his chair. The audition is in 3 days, he said calmly. You don't have to decide tonight. He slid the invitation slightly closer to her. But I hope you'll come. Then, after one final look at her, he walked toward the cafe door. Before leaving, he paused briefly. Oh, he added quietly. Your grandfather would have been very proud tonight. The waitress froze completely. She never told him about her grandfather, which meant he remembered. All these years later, he still remembered the older man who used to sit through every academy performance cheering louder than anyone else. The instructor gave a small nod before disappearing into the rainy night outside. The cafe stayed unusually quiet after that. Customers slowly returned to conversations, but the energy inside the room had changed again. Softer now, more thoughtful. The waitress remained sitting at the piano long after the instructor left. Her fingers rested lightly against the keys, while her mind drifted backward through years of memories she had tried hard to forget. She remembered being a little girl sitting beside her grandfather at an old piano almost identical to this one. Back then, music never felt complicated. If she made mistakes, they laughed together. If she forgot notes, he told her to create new ones. Music isn't about fear, he used to say. It's about feeling. Tears slowly filled her eyes, because somewhere along the way she stopped believing that. The cafe owner approached quietly and placed a warm cup of tea beside her. You okay? She nodded even though she clearly wasn't. He sat beside the piano bench carefully. You know, he said, when you first started working here, I honestly thought you hated that piano. She laughed softly through her emotions. Some days I did. But not anymore? She looked at the old instrument silently. Then she shook her head. No, she admitted quietly. Not anymore. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked empty to her. It looked terrifying, but also strangely possible. The next 3 days passed faster than she expected. Ever since the invitation arrived, her life no longer felt quiet. Every morning started with new messages, new comments online, and new people recognizing her in public. The cafe remained crowded every night with customers hoping to hear her play again. Some people traveled from nearby towns just to sit near the old piano. Others brought children who dreamed of learning music someday. At first, all the attention still made her nervous. She smiled politely, answered simple questions, and tried not to think too much about the jazz festival audition waiting ahead. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the invitation stayed constantly in her mind. The folded paper remained on her kitchen table at home. Every morning she looked at it. Every night she walked past it. Still, she had not made a final decision. On the second evening after meeting her former instructor, the cafe owner found her sitting alone beside the piano after closing time. You're thinking too much, he said while stacking clean cups behind the counter. She looked down at the piano keys. You make it sound simple. Sometimes it is simple. She laughed softly. Easy for you to say. You're not the one expected to perform in front of hundreds of people. The owner shrugged. No, but I am the guy who watched an entire room stop breathing while you played. She didn't respond. The owner walked closer and leaned against the piano carefully. "You know what I noticed?" he asked. "What?" "The first night you played here, you looked terrified before starting." "I was terrified. But halfway through the song," he continued, "you forgot to be afraid." His words stayed with her long after she returned home that night. 'Cause deep down she knew he was right. Whenever she truly connected with music, fear disappeared. The problem was everything before the first note. The night before the audition, she barely slept at all. She sat near her keyboard for hours in the dim apartment light, quietly practicing while the city outside remained dark and silent. Her fingers moved naturally across the keys, but her mind stayed restless. What if people expected too much now? What if the viral video created impossible expectations? What if the audience realized she wasn't as talented as they thought? Old fears slowly returned one after another. The same fears that once convinced her to leave music completely. Around 2 in the morning, she stopped playing and leaned back in her chair tiredly. Her eyes drifted toward an old framed photograph resting on the bookshelf nearby. It showed her as a little girl sitting beside her grandfather at a piano. Both of them were smiling widely. She picked up the picture carefully. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then quietly, she whispered something she had not said out loud in years. "I miss this. Not fame, not success, just the joy she once felt while playing. Simple joy." The next afternoon, she arrived at the jazz festival building with shaking hands. The event took place inside an old theater downtown. Outside, large posters advertised famous musicians performing throughout the weekend. People carrying instrument cases moved in and out of the building constantly. She almost turned around twice before reaching the entrance. Inside, the lobby buzzed with nervous energy. Pianists quietly practiced finger movements on their knees while singers reviewed notes under their breath. Everyone looked confident, professional, like they belonged there. She suddenly felt completely out of place again. A woman sitting behind the registration desk smiled politely. "Name?" The waitress gave it softly. The woman checked a list and nodded. "You'll perform in about 20 minutes. Her stomach twisted immediately. She walked into the waiting area and sat alone near the wall, trying to calm herself. Across the room, musicians talked casually with each other while holding coffee cups. Meanwhile, she couldn't even slow her breathing properly. Then a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You came." She looked up. Her former instructor stood nearby holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to her carefully before sitting beside her. "I wasn't sure if I would," she admitted. "I know." She stared down into the coffee silently. After a moment, he spoke again. "You don't need to prove anything today. That's hard to believe." He smiled faintly. "When you were younger, you treated every performance like a final exam." He paused briefly. "Music shouldn't feel like punishment." She looked at him carefully. "You really regret what happened back then, don't you?" The instructor didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. "Yes." The honesty in his voice surprised her again. "I spent too many years teaching students how to avoid mistakes," he continued quietly. "I should have spent more time teaching them how to love music." Before she could reply, a staff member entered the room. "You're up next." Instantly, her chest tightened again. The instructor stood beside her calmly. "Remember something," he said softly. "What?" "The audience isn't waiting for perfection." He gave a small smile. "They're waiting to feel something." A few minutes later, she stood backstage near the large curtains, while another performer finished on stage. Applause echoed through the theater while bright lights spilled across the floor ahead. Her hands felt cold. Voices from the audience blended together into nervous noise. She peeked carefully through the curtain. Hundreds of seats filled the theater. Judges sat near the front writing notes. Cameras stood near the stage. The sight almost made her lose courage completely. Then someone backstage whispered, "You're on." The theater lights dimmed slightly as her name was announced. She walked onto the stage slowly. For a second, The brightness of the lights made it impossible to see the audience clearly. But she could feel them watching. Every step toward the grand piano felt heavy. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the microphones might pick it up. She sat down carefully on the piano bench. Silence spread across the theater. The judges waited. The audience waited. She closed her eyes briefly. And suddenly memories returned again. Her grandfather laughing beside an old piano. The crowded café. The young girl who started practicing again after hearing her play. The customers who listened with tears in their eyes. Those memories steadied her breathing little by little. When she finally placed her fingers on the keys, her fear slowly loosened. She began with the same beginner melody that changed her life at the café. Soft, simple, gentle. A few audience members recognized it immediately and exchanged curious smiles. But then the music shifted. The melody opened into rich jazz harmonies filled with emotion and freedom. Fast notes danced through the theater while deep chords echoed powerfully beneath them. The piano no longer felt like an instrument, felt like a conversation. Every emotion she buried for years poured into the music naturally. Fear, loneliness, hope, relief. The judges slowly stopped writing. One leaned forward carefully. Another closed his eyes while listening. The audience became completely silent. Not distracted silence. Focused silence. The kind that only happens when people feel fully connected to something. Halfway through the performance, she forgot where she was. The theater disappeared. The pressure disappeared. Only the music remained. Her hands moved freely now, blending classical technique with fearless improvisation. The performance felt raw and alive in a way she had never allowed herself to play before. And for the first time in years, she finally understood something important. Music was never supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be honest. The final section of the performance slowed gently into softer melodies. Each note lingered beautifully through the theater before fading into silence. Then came the final chord. It echoed through the room one last time before disappearing completely. For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Then suddenly the audience stood. The applause exploded across the theater louder than anything she had ever heard before. People clapped while cheering loudly. Several audience members wiped tears from their faces. Even some judges smiled openly now instead of hiding behind professional expressions. The waitress sat frozen at the piano in complete disbelief. She had expected criticism, judgment, polite applause at best. Instead, the entire theater stood for her. Backstage, her former instructor watched silently with shining eyes. Because at that moment he realized something too. The young woman he once tried to shape into a perfect musician had become something far more powerful. Someone real. The applause inside the theater continued long after the performance ended. She remained seated at the piano for several seconds, unable to move. Bright stage lights reflected against the polished black surface of the instrument while hundreds of people stood clapping around her. Some audience members shouted praise loudly. Others simply smiled with tears in their eyes. The sound felt overwhelming. Not because people approved of her performance, but because for the first time in many years, she no longer felt invisible. Slowly, she stood from the piano bench. The audience continued clapping as she gave a small nervous bow before walking backstage. Her legs felt weak, almost like she had forgotten how to walk properly after pouring every emotion she carried into the music. The moment she stepped behind the curtain, several performers and staff members approached her immediately. "That was incredible. I've never heard improvisation like that before. You made the whole theater emotional." She thanked them politely, still struggling to process everything happening around her. Then she saw her former instructor standing quietly near the hallway wall. Unlike everyone else, he didn't rush toward her with excitement. He simply smiled. A real smile this time. "You did it," he said softly. She laughed nervously while trying to steady her breathing. "I thought I was going to faint before I even touched the piano." "That's normal." It didn't feel normal. The instructor chuckled lightly. "Fear never fully disappears before performances," he admitted. "You just learn not to let it control you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she looked at him carefully. You really think people connected with it? He seemed almost surprised by the question. Connected, he repeated quietly. The entire room stopped breathing while you played. Her eyes lowered. After years of criticism and self-doubt, hearing words like that still felt difficult to believe. A festival organizer suddenly approached holding several papers. There you are, the woman said with excitement. The judges would like to speak with you. Instant panic flashed across the waitress's face again. The instructor noticed immediately. Relax, he said calmly. You're not in trouble. A few minutes later, she entered a smaller room backstage where several judges sat around a table. The same serious people who had watched her performance earlier now looked far warmer than before. One older judge leaned forward first. How long have you been performing professionally? She hesitated awkwardly. I'm not really a professional performer. The judges exchanged surprised looks. Another judge frowned slightly. You're not signed with any group or agency? She shook her head. I work at a café. For a second, the room became strangely quiet. Then one of the judges smiled. Well, maybe not for much longer. Everyone laughed softly, easing her nerves a little. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes. The judges asked about her music background, her style of improvisation, and where she learned to blend jazz with emotional storytelling so naturally. She answered honestly. Most of what she knew came from years of practice with her grandfather long before formal music training ever began. One judge looked especially thoughtful after hearing that. That explains something, he said. What? Your playing doesn't sound manufactured. He folded his hands carefully. A lot of talented musicians perform with technical perfection but very little heart. You perform like someone telling the truth. That sentence stayed with her deeply, because for years, she believed emotion made her weak as a musician. Now people valued it most. Before leaving the room, the festival organizer handed her an envelope. We would officially like to invite you to perform during the final night of the festival this weekend. Her eyes widened immediately. The final night? The organizer nodded. It's our largest audience. For a moment, she couldn't speak at all. Only a week earlier, she had been quietly serving coffee while avoiding attention from everyone around her. Now people wanted her on one of the biggest stages in the city. Life suddenly felt unreal. When she finally stepped outside the theater later that evening, cool air hit her face gently. The city streets glowed under golden streetlights while groups of people still gathered near the theater entrance talking excitedly about performances. The moment some audience members recognized her, several approached asking for pictures and short conversations. At first, the attention still felt uncomfortable. But something inside her had changed now. She no longer felt ashamed of being seen. As she walked farther down the sidewalk, her phone buzzed again and again inside her coat pocket. New messages, interview requests, music invitations, social media pages asking to feature her story. She almost laughed from disbelief. A week ago, nobody knew who she was. Now strangers from different cities recognized her face. But strangely, the thing that mattered most to her that night was much smaller. As she passed a music store near the corner street, she noticed a little girl inside staring excitedly at a piano through the front window. The girl pressed invisible piano keys against the glass while her mother smiled beside her. The waitress stopped walking for a second, and suddenly remembered the young girl from the café who started practicing again because of her performance. That memory touched her more deeply than applause ever could. Because maybe success wasn't only about stages or fame. Maybe it was about reminding people not to give up on the things they love. The next evening, she returned to the café again. The owner had placed a small handwritten sign beside the old piano. The piano that started it all. She laughed the moment she saw it. You're being dramatic, she told him. Absolutely, he replied proudly. And customers love it. The café was packed again. But this time the atmosphere felt warm instead of overwhelming. Customers greeted her kindly, while soft conversations filled the room. Some people asked about the theater audition. Others simply thanked her for sharing her music. One older customer said something she would never forget. You know why people connect with you? She smiled politely. Why? Because you remind everyone what it feels like to stop hiding. Those words hit her hard. Because deep down, she knew that was exactly what this journey had really been about. Not becoming famous. Not proving critics wrong. Simply learning how to stop hiding from herself. Later that night after the cafe closed, she sat alone at the old piano again, while the owner cleaned tables quietly nearby. You know, he said casually, this place feels different now. How? People smile more here. She laughed softly. That sounds fake. I'm serious, he replied. Before all this, customers came in tired, stared at phones, drank coffee, then left. He pointed toward the piano. Now people actually listen to each other. She looked down at the keys silently. Music had changed the atmosphere of the cafe, but it had changed her even more. For years, she believed walking away from music meant safety. No pressure, no disappointment, no failure. But hiding had its own kind of pain too. Quiet pain. The kind that slowly makes life feel smaller over time. The cafe owner suddenly interrupted her thoughts. So, he asked, what happens now? She smiled faintly. I honestly don't know. And for once, that uncertainty didn't scare her. A few days later, the jazz festival's final performance night finally arrived. Thousands of people filled the outdoor venue across the city park. Bright lights covered the massive stage, while cameras moved through the crowd, capturing excited faces. Backstage, musicians prepared nervously, while staff members rushed around organizing equipment. The waitress stood quietly near the side curtain, wearing simple black clothes and holding trembling hands together. Despite everything she had already accomplished that week, nerves still returned before every performance. Then she felt someone gently hand her a folded note. It came from her former instructor. She opened it carefully. Inside, only one sentence was written. Play freely. Nothing else. She smiled immediately. A few moments later, the announcer introduced her to the crowd. Thunderous applause rose from thousands of people outside. She walked slowly onto the giant stage beneath bright lights and endless faces. For one brief second, fear returned again. Then she saw the piano waiting at center stage. And suddenly, she remembered who she was. Not a failed student. Not a nervous waitress hiding from life. Just someone who loved music deeply. She sat down at the piano bench. The crowd slowly became silent. Then her fingers touched the keys. And this time, she didn't play to impress anyone. She played because she was finally free.